Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to this most recent session of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. The reading so far have been very solid, and I've enjoyed going through the book with y'all, and we're going to be continuing section 2.2 today, as it's a very long section detailing specific examples of where different parts of Africa used to be versus where they were after underdevelopment. So continuing, we're going to be starting from chapter 2, section 2, and we're going to be starting from chapter F or section F of that section, the inner lacustrine zone. So without further ado, we can get started. Inner lacustrine zone. The high level of social evolution in the Western Sudan has been the cause of lengthy debates as to whether the region had achieved feudalism of the European variety, or whether it should be classed together with the great Asian empires, uh, or whether it created a new and unique category of its own. On the eastern side of the continent, development in the same period was definitely slower. For one thing, the people of East Africa acquired iron tools at a much later date than their brothers in the north and west, and secondly, the range of their technology and skills was narrower. However, by the 14th century, state formation was well underway, and the principles of development revealed in the process are worth considering. An area of special interest is that of the Great Lakes. Area of special interest is that of the Great Lakes of Africa, and particularly the zone around the group of lakes, which the British thought to fit to rename in honor of various members of the British ruling family Victoria. Albert Edward George. In that inner lacustrine zone, several famous states eventually emerged, one of the earliest and largest being that of Banyuro-Katara. Banyuro-Katara comprised in whole or in part the regions which today are called Banyuro, Anko, Toro, Karagwe, and Buganda, all of which fall in Uganda, except Karagwe, which is in Tanzania. Historical traditions have been orally preserved by these various peoples who at one time fell within the boundaries of Banyuro-Katara, and the traditions concentrate on the ruling dynasty, which is known as the Bakweze. The Bakweze were supposedly an immigrant pastoralist group. They introduced longhorn humped cattle, which later became the major species in the inner lacustrine zone. Possession of these cattle undoubtedly aided them to begin ruling aristocracy in the 14th and 15th centuries. They became a social stratum above the clans which previously existed and which had narrow territorial bases. The period of Barkwazi preeminence is also associated with ironworking, the manufacture of bark cloth, the technique of sinking well shafts through rocks, and, most striking of all, the construction of extensive earthwork systems, used apparently both for defense and for enclosing large herds of cattle. Um, the largest of the earthworks was at Bago, which with ditches extending over 6.5 miles.
The division of labor between pastoralists and cultivators and the nature of their contacts intensified the process of caste formation and class stratification in the inner lacustrine area. The pastoralist behemoth had imposed their rule over the cultivators of Beirut. Social classes grew out of a situation of changing labor relations. The earthworks of Bigot and elsewhere were not built by voluntary family labor, and some new form of coercion must also have been used to get the cultivator to produce a surplus for their new lords. For instance, the Bakwezi are said to have established a system by which young men were conscripted into the king's service and were maintained by Beirut, who occupied and cultivated land assigned for the support of the army. They also introduced slave artisans and administrators. When administrative officials were appointed at a local level to rule on behalf of the aristocrats, that was a first step towards setting up feudal fiefs as in Ethiopia. For while the question of land grants had not yet entered the picture, it must be borne in mind that inequality in the distribution of cattle meant in fact unequal access to the means of production. Much uncertainty surrounds the precise identification of the Bakwezi. It is possible that they were not immigrants, Nevertheless, it is generally held that they were light-complexioned pastoralists coming from the north.
Assuming that this was so, it is essential to stress that whatever was achieved in the inner Lacustrine region in the 14th and 15th centuries was a product of the evolution of African society as a whole and not a transplant from outside. In order to place those East African events within the context of universal human achievement, a parallel can be drawn with India. Centuries before the birth of Christ, northern India was also the recipient of light complexioned pastoral immigrants known as Aryans. There was a time when everything in Indian culture was attributed to the Aryans, but then careful scrutiny revealed that the basis of Indian society and culture had been laid by the earlier population known as the Dravidians. Therefore, it is now considered far more sensible to see the achievements of North India as a product of synthesis or combination of Aryan and Dravidian. Similarly, in East Africa, one needs to seek the elements of synthesis between the new and the old, and that in effect was the path of development in the inner Lacustrine zone in the 14th and 15th centuries. As has just been noted, the Bakwazi are associated with techniques such as ironworking and bark cloth manufacture. It is not at all clearly established that they introduced such techniques for the first time, and it is much more probable that they presided over the elaboration of such skills. Certainly, iron-using societies were known in East Africa several centuries before the Bakwazi period. At Angra Ruka, just south of the present Kenya-Tanzania border, there are to be found the ruins of a small but impressive Iron Age society, which flourished sometime before the end of the first millennium AD, i.e., before 1000 AD. Angra Ruka was a concentrated agricultural settlement engaging in terracing, irrigation, and the construction of walls by the technique known as dry stone building, whereby no line was required to hold the stones together. In the inner lacustrine area itself, there had emerged a banana-based agriculture, which was capable of supporting a large sedentary population. That was the sort of precondition for moving from communal isolation to statehood. It is significant that orally preserved traditions imply the existence of kingdoms in Bunyoro and Kauragwe before Bekwazi. State formation was already in an embryo stage when the outsiders arrived, and the likelihood is that they did not remain outsiders for long. Unlike the Aryans in India, the Bakwazi did not impose their own language, but adopted the Bantu speech of the local inhabitants. That reflects the dominance of local rather than foreign elements in the synthesis. In any event, the cultural product was African and was part of the pattern of development through localized evolution combined with the interplay of social formations on a continent-wide scale. Among the contributions supposedly made by the Bakwazi to the inner Lacustrine kingdoms was the introduction of religion based on the phases of the moon. In all of the situations examined so far, religion played a significant role in promoting the building of the state, leading away from the simple organization of the family community. Christianity and Islam have been most frequently associated with large scale building both inside and outside of Africa. That is to be explained not so much by the actual religious beliefs, but because membership in a powerful universal church gave the ruling class of a young state many advantages. A Christian or Muslim prince had access to a literate culture and a wider world. Yeah, he dealt with traders and craftsmen professing that religion. He used administrators and churchmen who were literate. And he could travel to parts of the world such as Mecca. The universal religions replaced quote unquote traditional African ancestral religions in Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, Maghreb, and progressively in the Western Sudan, because Christianity and Islam were not rooted in any given family community and therefore could be used to mobilize to the many communities that were merging into the state. However, religious beliefs had been accepted by a single clan or ethnic group, which had been accepted by a single clan or ethnic group, could be elevated in the same form or in a slightly altered form to become the religion of the whole state. This was the situation in the interlacustrine zone, and indeed in most other parts of Africa outside the regions they already described. This is a very interesting section. Let's talk about it a little bit before we move on to this part about Zimbabwe. So what we have is they're talking about. So they're talking about the economic makeup. So when we go up, we can read a little bit about what was it they were saying here. On the eastern side of the continent, development in the same period was slower. For one thing, the people of East Africa acquired iron tools at a much later date than the brothers in the north and west. Secondly, the range of their technology and skills was narrower. However, by the 14th century, state formation was underway, and the principles of development revealed in the process are worth considering. So already we have this establishment that even though in some ways, such as with the accumulation of iron tools and being able to put them to good use even after having them, even though that was a little bit of a slower process. The principles of development still end up revealing themselves as early as the 14th century in the region. And then they were talking about eventually a few different states emerge in that region. And one of the largest one of those was Benuro-Katara. And Benuro-Katara was part of the region that are now called, let's see, Banyoro and Kole, Toro, Karagwe, and Buganda, all of which fall in Uganda, except Karagwe, which is in Tanzania. So these were like pretty prominent areas that were starting to prop up even as early as the 14th century, thanks to how things have been going. It talks about the role of religion in the region and how religion, and we're starting to see it as a theme now, had been mostly focused on like this communal aspect and like, this like almost familial contract where you get involved with a family and you work along the context of improving the lot of the family, and as opposed to Abrahamic religions, which are not necessarily built around labor, even though the Abrahamic religions do definitely have a lot to say about the importance of working. They don't themselves, at least to this day, enforce any specific standard of labor. If anything, they end up serving reactionary forces on the subject of labor, but that's a different conversation for a different day. So it's talking about the Bekwaze and how in the region they introduced Longhorn humps cattle, and that ended up being a major species in the region. Possession of these cattle aided them to be a ruling aristocracy in the 14th and 15th centuries. So we can see development is just happening along a few lines, and that's not anything that I've ever known about for sure. Uh, so the period of Baklavaze preeminence is also associated with ironworking, the manufacture of bark cloth, the technique of sinking whale shafts through rocks, and most striking of all, the construction of extensive earthwork systems, used apparently both for defense and for enclosing large herds of cattle. Uh, the largest of the earthworks was at Bego, with ditches extending over 6.5 miles, which is wild as hell to me. That's wild. So they were literally using ironwork to not only herd cattle, but to defend themselves. And this is as early as the 14th and 15th century. Definitely not anything we're ever taught about in um, how the region and how Mother Africa as a whole has ended up. So that's really important stuff that he's talking about in this section. Uganda is my home, Saber says. A lot of communal elements are still in place last time I went. I spent some time in the rural areas. Banana trees everywhere. That's cool as hell. Hell yeah. I want to go to Uganda myself one day. In Zimbabwe, one of the great constructions in brick. No, that's all good, Saber. Uh, in Zimbabwe, one of the great constructions in brick, dated around the 14th century, is commonly referred to as temple and is felt to have served religious purposes. Even from the scanty evidence, it is clear that the religious aspect of social development was of the greatest importance in serving to cement ties between individuals and that emerging African society. For instance, the ruling class in the 15th century empire of Mutapa in Zimbabwe were pastoralists, and their religious ritual included objects that were symbolic of cattle, as we found in the inner Lacustrine kingdoms such as Banyoro and Karagwe. One can guess that the rituals also symbolized the dominance of the cattle owners, just as they also paid respect to pre existing ideas of the cultivators in order to effect a stable synthesis. The details of the picture are not available in the present stage of knowledge, but what is required is that any discussion of African religion must seek to present it in a mobile, evolutionary manner and to relate it to changing socio-economic forms and institutions. that task being beyond the confines of the present study. It is proposed to examine Zimbabwe as yet another region where the productive base and the political superstructure can be ascertained to have developed appreciably in the last few centuries before Africa was drawn into contact with Europe. Within the southernmost section of the continent, the area in which striking achievements were registered by the 15th century was that between the rivers uh, Zambezi and Limpopo, covering the territories that were later to be called Mozambique and Rhodesia. Iron using and state building peoples were active there from early in the first millennium. And eventually, AD, and eventually there emerged in the 15th century an empire which Europeans called Monomotapa. The term Zimbabwe is being used here to designate the Zambezi Limpopo cultures in the few centuries preceding the European arrival, because it was from the 11th to the 14th century that there were flourished the societies whose most characteristic feature was the building of large stone palaces, known collectively as Zimbabwe. Much has been written about the buildings which distinguish the Zimbabwe culture. They are a direct response to the environment of granite rocks, being built upon granite hills and of flaked granite. The most famous site of surviving stone ruins is that of Great Zimbabwe, north of the river Sabi. One of the principal structures at Great Zimbabwe was some 300 feet long and 220 feet broad, with the walls being 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. The technique of laying the bricks, one on the other, without lime to act as a cement, was the same style noted in the description of Ingaruka in northern Tanzania. It was in fact a peculiar aspect of the material culture in Africa, being widely found in Ethiopia and the Sudan. The style of the encircling brick walls at Great Zimbabwe and other sites was also characteristically African, in that it was an elaboration of the mud enclosures or kraals of many Bantu-speaking people. One European archaeologist is reported to have said that there was as much labor expended in Zimbabwe as on the pyramids in Egypt. That is surely an overstatement, for the pyramids were raised through an incredible amount of slave labor, which cannot possibly have been at the disposal of the rulers in Zimbabwe. However, it is definitely necessary to reflect on the amount of labor which would have been required to construct the buildings within the Zimbabwe region up until the 15th century. Uh, the workers may have well been from particular ethnic groups who were subjugated by other ethnic groups, but in the process of subjugation, they were acquiring the character of social class whose labor was being exploited. Nor was it sheer manual labor. Skill, creativity, and artistry went into the construction of the walls, especially with regard to the decorations, the inner recesses, and the doors. Oh, that's a beautiful picture you took there, Saber. I'll have to post it in the video when we get this uploaded. When Cecil Rhodes sent in his agents to rob and steal in Zimbabwe, they and other Europeans marveled at the surviving ruins of the Zimbabwe culture and automatically assumed that it had been built by white people. Even today, there is still a tendency to consider the achievements with a sense of wonder rather than with the calm acceptance that it was a perfectly logical outgrowth of human social development within Africa, as part of the universal process by which man's labor opened up new horizons. The sense of reality can only be restored by making it clear that the architecture rested on a foundation of advanced agriculture and mining, which had come into existence over centuries of evolution. Zimbabwe was a zone of mixed farming, with cattle being important since the area is free from tsetse flies. Irrigation and terracing reached considerable proportions. There was no single dam or aqueduct comparable to those in Asia or ancient Rome, but countless small streams were diverted and made to flow around hills, in a manner that indicated an awareness of the scientific principles governing the motion of water. In effect, the people of Zimbabwe had produced hydrologists through their understanding of the material environment. On the mining side, it is equally striking that the African peoples in the zone in question had produced prospectors and geologists who had a clear idea of where to look for gold and copper in the subsoil. When the European colonialists arrived in the 19th century, They found that virtually all the gold-bearing and copper-bearing strata had been mined previously by Africans. Of course it had, though of course not on the same scale as Europeans were to achieve with drilling equipment. That makes sense, I guess. Among the Zimbabwe people, there were or also arose craftsmen who worked the gold into ornaments with tremendous skill and lightness of touch. The presence of gold in particular was a stimulus to external trade, and in turn, it was external demand which did most to accelerate mining. In the first millennium AD, there was a gold using aristocracy at Ngombe Elide, just north of the Zimbabwe. Presumably, they got their supplies from gold mines further south. However, gold is required in large quantities only in a society which produces a very large economic surplus and can afford to transform part of that surplus into gold for prestige purposes, as in India, or into coinage and money to promote capitalism, as in Western Europe. The pre feudal African societies did not have such a surplus nor the social relations which made it necessary for gold to circulate a great deal internally. Hence, it was the presence of Arab traders as far south as Sofala and the Mozambique Channel, which spurred Zimbabwe to mine more gold for export just about the same time in the 11th century when stone building was beginning. The implication is that a number of factors coincided, namely the intensification of class stratification, of state consolidation, of production and building techniques, and of trade. Several different ethnic groups contributed to Zimbabwe's society. The earliest population of the region were the Bushmen and Khoisan type of hunters who today are found only in small numbers in southern Africa. They were incorporated into the physical stock of newcomers from further north speaking Bantu languages, and in fact, they made their contribution to the Bantu languages of the area. Among the Bantu speakers, there were also several different groups coming into their own at different times. The material evidence which has been revealed by archaeologists shows various pottery styles, contrasting burial positions and different bone structures among skeletons. Other material artifacts show that over the centuries, many societies occupied the region of Zimbabwe. Much of the interpenetration of one group by another was done peacefully, although at the same time, the very existence of the fortified hilltops and stone defenses show that the larger states were engaged in military struggles for survival and preeminence. Furthermore, some ethnic groups must have been permanently relegated to inferior status so as to provide the labor for agriculture, building, and mining. Other clans specialized in pastoralism, warfare, and the control of religious apparatus such as divination and rainmaking. It is believed that the inhabitants of Zimbabwe in the 11th to the 14th centuries were Sotho speaking. But by the time the Portuguese arrived, the Shona speaking dynasty had taken control of most of the region. That was the Roswy clan which set up the state of Mutapa between the Zimbabwe and the Limpopo. The ruler was known as Mwane Mutapa, which apparently meant the great lord of Mutapa to his own followers, but was held to mean the great pillager by peoples whom he conquered and wielded together into a single empire. The first individual to hold the title Mwane Mutapa ruled from about 1415 to 1450, but the dynasty had already been growing prominent before that date. The capital was at first sited at Great Zimbabwe and later moved north. What was important was that the Mwane Mutapa appointed governors to rule over various localities outside the capital in a manner comparable to that of the Western Sudanic empires or the Lucastrine Bakwazi states. The Rajwi lords of Mutapa did most to encourage production for export trade, notably in gold, ivory, and copper. Arab merchants came to reside in the kingdom in the Zimbabwe region, became involved in the network of Indian Ocean commerce, which linked them with India, Indonesia, and China. One of the principal achievements of the Rosway lords of Mutapa was to organize a single system of production and trade. They exacted tribute from the various communities in their kingdoms, which was both a sign of sovereignty and a form of trade, because the movement of goods was stimulated. There is no doubt that the foreign trade strengthened the Mutapa state, but above all, it strengthened the ruling strata, which had a monopoly over that aspect of economic activity. In comparison with other African elites at that time, the Razwe of Zimbabwe still had a long way to go. They were not in the same category as the Amorite nobility of Ethiopia or the Arab Berber feudal lords of the Maghreb. They did imbibe a few influences from outside, but they did not travel like the rulers of Malé and Songhai who made the pilgrimage to Mecca. Their dress was still mainly animal skins and such cloth, as they were utilized were recent imports from the Arab traders rather than the product of the evolution of their own skills in that field. In that respect, Zimbabwe also trailed behind other early African states such as Olio and Yorubaland, Benin, and the same. In the 14th century Empire of Congo, which Europeans refer to as the greatest state in West Africa at the time of their arrival. It has been considered necessary for the purposes of illustration to consider, though by no means all, of the outstanding areas of development in Africa before the coming of the Europeans. Nor should it be forgotten that there were innumerable village communities emerging to become states that were small in size, but were sometimes sharply stratified internally and displayed an impressive level of material advance. Those described above should be sufficient to establish that Africa in the 15th century was not just a jumble of different so called tribes. There was a pattern and there was historical movement. Societies such as feudal Ethiopia and Egypt were at the furthest points of the process of evolutionary development. Zimbabwe and the Bakwazi states were also clearly on the ascendant away from communalism, but at a lower level than the feudal states, and a few others that were not yet feudal, such as those in the Western Sudan. Let's see what we got here. Yeah. So we can before we head to the conclusion and wrap up for the day for the week, we can talk about this section on Zimbabwe for a little bit. So he's making it clear that why Zimbabwe uh, developed a little differently than or what we call Zimbabwe today, developed a little differently than other parts of Africa. It very much still the Europeans were showing up to find that gold was already being mined, even if it wasn't to the same extent that they were able to do with the drilling equipment. He's showing so he says, on the mining side, it is equally striking that the African peoples in the zone in question have produced prospectors and geologists who had a clear idea of where to look for gold and copper in the subsoil. And it's just really interesting that they would frame this surprise that way, as if people would not have had an interest in knowing how to work their own land and take advantage of the resources of their own land. This is a but Europeans very much always did so express surprise when Africans could accomplish anything at all. So it's interesting that Rodney points that out. He says Zimbabwe was a zone of mixed farming, with cattle being important since the area is free from ZC flies. Irrigation and terracing reached considerable proportions. There was no single dam or aqueduct comparable to those in Asia and ancient Rome, but countless small streams were diverted and made to flow around hills, in a manner that indicated an awareness of the scientific principles governing the motion of water. So even if there wasn't the technology to build, what we would think of as aqueducts, for example, there were still the principles that were being in place in order to make the water workable. And just going through this section on Zimbabwe, it is just another example of how land itself is integral to Africa. Land itself being the most important mean of production for Africans, and you can just start to see how insidious it is that Africans have been cut off from having any access to land, especially in the context of the USA, where you have to enter the petty bourgeois class at worst to or at best rather, just to be able to get access to land that you were uh, historically taught was your mean of sustenance, was your mean of providing for your family, and that's just being made obvious as we go through this Zimbabwe section. We have one European archaeologist is reported to have said that there was as much labor expended in Zimbabwe as on the pyramids in Egypt. That is certain. He says that's an overstatement, for the pyramids were raised through an incredible amount of slave labor, which could not possibly have been at the disposal of the rulers of Zimbabwe. However, it is definitely necessary to reflect on the amount of labor which would have been required to construct the buildings within the Zimbabwe region up until the 15th century. So there was so much vast, there were so many vast buildings in the country, or in the region rather, that it was being theorized by reactionary archaeologists that there must have been just as much work being done there to build those buildings as what was being done with the slave labor that was conscripted to build the pyramids, which, while Rodney says is definitely an overstatement, says speaks to the vastness of what did exist in Zimbabwe to that time. So that's another interesting point you bring. When Europeans found out that Africans and new advanced metallurgy and agricultural techniques. Wow, I mean exactly. So they always trying to play the hell out of crazy when we know what the fuck we're doing, with our own damn families and our own damn land. It's wild how we're just expected to just know nothing that they can teach us. It's super weird, but we're also not that weird at all. We know where they're coming from, and it's not exactly the best place. Among the Bantu speakers, there were also different several groups coming into their own at different times. The material evidence, which has been revealed by archaeologists, shows various pottery styles, contrasting burial positions, and different bone structures among skeletons. Other material artifacts show that over the centuries, many societies occupied the region of Zimbabwe. So not only is Zimbabwe developing along its own material conditions, but to the extent that it's developing along its material conditions, different kinds of groups are popping up in the area. So it's multi-ethnic in a way that we're not even necessarily taught to think about multi-ethnic. And they're necessarily introducing different styles of pottery, different burial position, contrasting styles, and the way things will be buried. And then, of course, the different bone structures that he's bringing up show that these people were having different development for themselves based on all the factors that go into development that we know of, such as dieting and other kinds of different material conditions. So it's really interesting. This idea that African people are not diverse, and yet how many times so far has Rodney already debunked this horse shit? It's real interesting. So we can go to the conclusion. If anybody wants to read that, they can. Otherwise, I'll read the conclusion. We'll be able to wrap up for this week.
I can give it a try. All right. In introducing the concept of development, attention was drawn to the fact that the slow, imperceptible expansion in social productive capacity ultimately amounted to a qualitative difference, with the arrival at the new stage sometimes being announced by social violence. It can be said that most African societies had not reached a new stage that was markedly different from communalism, and hence the use in this study of the cautious term, quote unquote, transitional. It can also be noted that nowhere had there been any internal social revolutions. The latter have taken place in Europe, in European and world history, only where class consciousness led to the massive intervention of people's will within the otherwise involuntary socio-economic process. Such observations helped to situate African development up to the 15th century at a level that was below mature class-ridden feudalism. It should also be reiterated that slavery as a mode of production was not present in any African society, although some slaves were to be found where the decomposition of communal equality had gone furthest. This is an outstanding feature illustrating the autonomy of the African path within the broader framework of universal advance. One of the paradoxes in studying this early period of African history is that it cannot be fully comprehended without first deepening our knowledge of the world at large. And yet the true picture of complexities of the development of man and society can only be drawn after extensive study of the long-neglected African continent. There is no escaping the use of comparisons as an aid to clarity, and indeed the parallels have been narrowly restricted to Europe, when they could also be provided by examples from Asian history. Therein lies the cultural imperialism which makes it easier for the European-educated African to recall names like the French capitains and the Prussian Hohenzollerns, rather than the Vietnamese dynasties of Id and Tran, for the latter unknown, or either unknown to him, or would be considered unimportant if known, or might even be judged too difficult to pronounce. Several historians of Africa have pointed out that after surveying the developed areas of the continent in the 15th century and those within Europe at the same date, the difference between the two was in no way to Africa's discredit. Indeed, the first Europeans to reach West and East Africa by sea were the ones who indicated that in most respects, African development was comparable to that which they knew. To take but one example, when the Dutch visited the city of Benin, they described it thus. The town seems to be very great. When you enter into it, you go into a broad street, not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoes Street in Amsterdam. The King's Palace is a collection of buildings which occupy as much space as the town of Haarlem, and which is enclosed with walls. There are numerous apartments for the princes, ministers, and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the Exchange at Amsterdam. They are supported by wooden pillars encased with copper, where their victories are depicted, and which are carefully kept very clean. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide. Apart from an infinity of small intersecting streets, the houses are close to one another, arranged in good order. The people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that they are polished and shining like a looking glass. Yet it would be self-delusion to imagine that all things are exactly equal in Benin and in Holland. European society was already more aggressive, more expansionist, and more dynamic in producing new forms. The dynamism within Europe was contained within the merchant and manufacturing class. In the galleries of the Exchange at Amsterdam sat Dutch burghers, the ancestors of the modern bourgeoisie of industry and finance. This class in 15th century Europe was able to push the feudal landlords forward and aside. They began to discard conservatism and to create the intellectual climate in which change was seen as desirable. A spirit of innovation arose in technology, and transformation of the mode of production was quickened. When Europe and Africa established close relations through trade, there was therefore already a slight edge in Europe's favor, an edge representing the difference between a fledgling capitalist society and one that was still emerging from communalism. Brief guide to reading. Studies on early African history are lacking for many reasons. The most obvious being that African history was for a long time considered by the colonialists as having so little value that it was not worth reconstructing. Another decisive factor is that studies of Africa were carried out mainly by European bourgeois anthropologists, whose philosophical outlook on primitive societies caused them to separate African society from its historical context. There was a concentration on micro-units and no reference to overall patterns. The new African scholarship has been underway for a short time to have provided any significant breakthrough. The few books cited below are of the new approach. Africa in History by B. Davidson, Africa Before the White Man by Henry Leberet, Ancient African Kingdoms by M. Shinney, and The Serpent and the Crescent by M. Panikar. The above group of books are assessments by non-Africans from a sympathetic perspective and with sufficient value for them to be respected and widely used inside Africa. Panikar is an unusual example of an Asian scholar with a professional interest in the African continent. Then we have 1,000 Years of West African History, Zamani, a survey of East Africa history. African historians have begun to provide syntheses of the continent's history by putting together relevant collections, usually on some section of the continent, as in the two examples above. Unfortunately, the quality varies from one section to another, and African writers have not as yet provided any coherent overview of the regions with which they are supposedly dealing. And then we have Yoruba culture, a geographical analysis, and Southern Africa during the Iron Age. What these two dissimilar books have in common is an awareness of the material environment. Afolabi Ojo is a Nigerian geographer, and B.M. Fagan is an English archaeologist. So yeah, that's chapter 2 done. I guess we're moving into chapter 3 next time.
Indeed, that's chapter 2 done. Yeah, we've done a lot to just go over exactly what development is and what underdevelopment is as of chapter 1. And in chapter 2, we got a lot of concrete examples of exactly um, what kind of material context Africa existed under by visiting different regions of Africa. And we also had a very nuanced take on the differences between even the peoples themselves who were living in Africa prior to the 14th and 15th century. So we are well on our way to being able to understand exactly what it is that goes into, well, just what the title says, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So I'm super excited about learning about it with y'all. What were some of your takeaways, Saber?
One thing that stood out to me in this last section, anyways, is that back then, before we had like widespread uh like structural racism and the ideologies to make Africans seem like primitive or whatever, you can see clear examples of them just straight up saying, "Oh, like these cities are actually pretty base." You know what I mean? So like, so at the time they didn't really have an issue with singing the praises of what they found. And I think earlier as well. I don't know if we've even gotten to this point, but when kind of reminds me of the another section in the book where he talks about some of the Portuguese coming to certain countries in Africa and being impressed by like the metallurgy and the fabrics and stuff like that, and even in some cases preferring over their own stuff. So yeah, clearly wasn't a massive disparity. Obviously, they developed in different uh, under different conditions, but yeah, we were definitely well on our way to development as well. I actually have a question actually. So when it comes to like agricultural development, do you think that the fertility of the land has anything to do with like how quickly or how slowly a place like develops? So like for instance, if you already live in a very fertile area and you're still developing alongside that, like is it really that necessary to put as much effort into developing agriculture as it is in an area that has more arid land, like in Europe?
That's a really good question. So, uh, what we end up finding as we read other different texts that talk about different agrarian societies, whether it be the agrarian society of the USSR, the agrarian societies that existed in different regions in China and all throughout Africa, what we end up finding is that overemphasizing agriculture in an economy in a world where the economy is necessarily trending toward needing to have cooperative relationships with other regions and other countries actually ends up to one extent or another stifling development, because what ends up happening is there just isn't necessarily productive forces being developed in other ways that can match the level of agriculture in an area where the agriculture is already naturally rich. So then what you see is the countries and the regions of the world that necessarily come to that understanding can then kind of use that naturally rich land and what it is they're literally able to produce as a bartering tool. So to one extent, it is a deterrent on development, but only if you're willing to kind of divorce yourself away from the larger material context to get what it is you might need for development. So if a country or a region is not developing in one way, but another country is not developing in the way that your country is, then you're in an advantageous position where you can quite literally go and say to another country, hey, you know, We don't have quite um, the level of problems y'all do with grain and with growing this crop and that crop. We have it in abundance. If you're willing to like negotiate with us, I'm sure we can come to like a workable agreement. And so that's how. To that time, development would have just been being facilitated. It would have been being facilitated by just literally negotiating and bartering and seeing what you can do about the abundance that necessarily results from, in some cases, overproduction, and in some cases just excess production, and being able to build good political relationships with other regions. Now, colonialism has taken that logic and distorted it because it then has outsiders who understand this very same concept come in and quite literally seize, the naturally fertile territory and then use it for their own ends. And then you'll have, in some more nefarious cases, you'll have them quite literally threatening to use the resources of another of a colonized people's country against other colonized peoples. Like, so, for example, the DPRK, how they'll use uh they'll take control of like wheat, for example, and then a person living in the north will need access to wheat, and all they have to trade is cattle, or all they have to not trade even necessarily, but to work with is the cattle and the little land that they have. So then, according to some sources, they'll then do something like, oh well, if you want access to the fucking wheat that we are only control of through colonization, you'll have to like cut off the tail so that you of the cow, so that the cow is unbalanced, and as such you won't be able to work the land in nearly as efficient a way because you'll be down cattle if you want access to what it is you're going to need to be able to continue engaging in anything close to a healthy diet. You can see this sort of behavior being prominent all throughout Africa as well. So, yeah, the answer to that question is, unfortunately, that the colonizers very much use even natural development and what naturally occurs in a region. I'm kind of toward the logic of imperialism and colonialism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. And especially in situations where they decide what the crops would be at a given time. So like, okay, like you have to produce these ground nuts or whatever, and you can't produce anything else because you have a quota to meet or whatever. And then in a situation where there's some kind of somewhere for some reason, intentionally or unintentionally,
Mm-hmm.
they won't be able to meet their needs because they can't exchange for the things that they need. Uh, and so you'd have like a lot of famines and stuff like that, which is what happened across the continent as well. So like when people talk about colonialism and stuff, and they're like, "Oh, but like, see, look how bad it was. Look what Leopold did." You know what I mean? So it's like, which is like, yeah, of course. But then they forget about all of the other things, as though like everything else was smooth sailing, which is just not true.
What else say like, well, look at where the country is compared to where it was, which is like whatever. But like, what to the extent that the country has more than what it had, whose hands is like the fruit of the colonialism in? It's not in the hands of Africans. It's in the hands of colonizers who don't even live in Africa. So it's this idea that colonialism has somehow benefited Africa, which is an idea that reactionaries have been putting out there. It's just a historical horseshit, and just straight up doing apologia for imperialism and colonialism.
When they try to, it's ironic because when they try to use that argument, they'll be like, well, but look at China. Use China as an example, and it's just like, yeah, it seems to be so much wrong with that. That's just, yeah, it's like they obviously had a very clear objective. They're moving in a very particular way, and at least from what they're saying, anyways, they still have a long-term goal in mind. And it isn't because of like isn't because of the domination from the West that they're in the position that they are. It's kind of like in spite of it, I guess. They're doing well regardless. So like they're like an exception to the rule, I think. When compared to other places that weren't necessarily able to get the boot off of their neck, and they're still underdeveloped because of that. Um,
Exactly. So yeah, it's always important to just remember that the benefit, the logic of imperialism does not lead to benefit for the colonized, even if the logic of imperialism necessarily uh, leads to the colonizers conscripting the labor, of the colonized in order to develop, how imperialism necessarily wants to facilitate develop. But this is not the same thing as being material benefit, for the colonized people. This is a, you know, this is this is this is a smoke and mirrors relationship meant to get you to be desensitized and indifferent, to imperialism or to colonialism. Because if they can just get you saying to yourself, well, look, it seems to be better. They have beautiful buildings. Look how beautiful the country is. Then you'll never actually be asking questions about what the inner workings of the country are, what the logic of imperialism is, what the end game is, and as such, you'll never get yourself involved in any sort of decolonial struggle, which is exactly what these colonizers hope for when they engage in these kinds of campaigns in the first place. So yeah, those were really good. That was a really good question, Saber. I appreciate it. So yeah, y'all, we're gonna wrap up. We'll be able to finally start chapter 3 in our next reading of Walter Rodney's "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa." So we have that to look forward to. Until then, comrades, solidarity always. Y'all take care, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday for Walter Rodney's "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa," chapter 3.